Good morning, David. How are you doing today?
Great, Arrow. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, because you've done something with this book that a lot of people don't understand, have never understood, because we all want victory when it comes to business success. But what you're going to share with us is, hey, look, it comes with a price, and Jack, kind of had to pay the price.
We all had to pay the price
You're right.
for what he did, and I think we're all still paying the price.
How do you research something like this? Because there are people that are going to take you on saying, but I'm living life the best I can because Jack showed us the way.
Well, let me back up and tell you a little bit about how I came to this story, which maybe explains how I got into the researching. So I'm a reporter here at the New York Times, and my job for the last 5 years really has been interviewing CEOs. I write the corner office column, and I've interviewed CEO after CEO. And time and again, over the 5 years of doing that, one man's name came up, and it was Jack Welch.
Wow.
And that was just bugging me, right? I thought it was weird that this guy who had retired like 20 years ago was still living rent-free in the minds of today's business leaders. Something was up with that. But then I came upon a story that really brought it all home. I was part of the investigative reporting team that looked into Boeing after the tragic crashes of those two 737 MAX planes in 2018 and 2019. And when we started looking into what had happened at Boeing, it was clear that there was a software problem and a hardware problem with the plane. But it became obvious that there was a cultural problem with Boeing. And when we tried to understand the cultural problem at Boeing, it became a story of Jack Welch. Over 25 years, three of his proteges got in charge of Boeing, became CEO of that company, and systematically changed it and its priorities. And that ultimately led to this short-term focus inside the company that contributed to the crashes. And so when I saw all that, I was like, this is the guy that explains this broken world we live in. And then I was off to the races.
So when you get into an investigative reporting like that, how do you convince those, your real job people, that, hey, look, I'm onto something and I need to do this in a personal way because it's not going to make the front page of the newspaper, but yet you're going to turn it into a book?
Well, it was on the front page of the newspaper. Our Boeing reporting that got into those cultural programs, the problems inside the company, that was one of our major projects for the entire year. There was at one point a team of more than 40 people working on this for the New York Times because we recognized that this could seem boring to people, right? What's happening inside companies, cultural changes. But these are people's lives at stake. And it's not just the tragic lives of the 346 people that died on those planes and their families who are still grieving to this day. It's the lives of all the people in the factories that were shuttered by men like Welch. It's all the people who were laid off in these waves of downsizing that Welch and his proteges undertook simply in an effort to make their companies a bit more profitable. Not because the factories weren't working, but because Wall Street wanted fatter profit margins. And one way to do that was to close some factories. That's the suffering that comes as a result of really misguided short-term business practice. And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to call out with this book.
Do you think that today's process in business where people don't want to work is still connected to someone like Jack in the way that businesses have cut back so much that we've lost that trust and faith in those that we once supported? And if they're not going to support us, why should we support them?
I think you're onto something there, right? Like the degree to which we put our CEOs up on pedestals, the degree to which we worship our business leaders rather than Nobel scientists, like the people actually fixing things in the world, right? Why is it? Why is it that some of the greatest icons of our time are just men and the few women who have managed to become billionaires? I just think that says something about our priorities. And that's another thing I'm starting to try to call out here is like, are these really the people we want to be our heroes? But when you then try to tie that back to how do people feel about business today, absolutely, right? Like the hollowness, I think, of that enterprise, the hollowness of that hero worship, of this reverence of simply like materialism, I think it's taken its toll on this country over the last several decades. And when people don't feel loyal to their workforce, that's not only, in my view, a reflection of sort of a recognition that maybe these aren't the people we want to be looking up to, but it's also a reflection of Jack Welch's campaign against loyalty. He deliberately got into that company, GE, starting in the early 80s, and systematically changed the way it operated so that people would feel less loyal. He didn't want people to be attached to their company, and I would argue he largely succeeded on that front, though I don't think the country's better for it.
Oh, my God. I mean, you're bringing up like a huge flashback of yesterday's headlines in the way that I know one CEO that stepped forward yesterday and said, if you don't report back to the office, I'm going to take that as your resignation. And I'm telling you, this guy is starting to feel more like a dictator and not a CEO. And I think you know who I'm talking about.
When I wrote the first excerpt of this book, which was published about 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, the headline was How Jack Welch Gave Us Elon Musk.
Yes.
There's a direct line between these two men when you think about their imperial, impulsive, combative nature and their conviction, his conviction that simply because he's the richest man in the world, and Jack Welch, mind you, became one of the richest men in the world simply by being a manager, right? Elon at least created some things. He started a couple companies. Jack never started a company. He was a paid manager and he became a billionaire practically for it. But this conviction that simply because they are rich, they know what's best for the rest of us, that's crazy, and that's got to change.
One of the things, how I can relate with this book so much is because you talk about shareholders. I've been a shareholder for decades. And the thing is, though, is that I'm also a regular person. But as that regular person, I'm always told by my financial person, shh, don't say anything. It'll work itself out. Sometimes I think that these CEOs like Jack Welch are the ones going, hey, look, I got people working on this. They're going to quiet down the masses. And then once they do, then we can move on with my vision.
I think what we're seeing right now in the markets is with these wild swings, the crash that we've all been experiencing over the last few weeks and months. Listen, this is partly a reflection of the concentration of wealth in this country. Today, you may be a shareholder, but fewer Americans proportionally own stock than at almost any time in the last half century or so, maybe more. And that speaks to the degree to which the riches of this land, which is largely a reflection of the profits created by our big corporations, simply are not getting distributed evenly. And listen, if every household in this nation had stock, we would not have these wild gyrations in the stock market. That's partly the result of a concentrated group of institutional shareholders moving their shares in bulk. Yep. So what I'd love to see and what I call for in the book is big companies giving their employees more stock. Big companies finding ways to share these profits, tens of billions of dollars of profits, with the men and women in your community, listening to this radio station in the middle of the country, all over the country. These are the people doing the work. They're the ones that deserve the profits.
You talk about the radio stations and stuff like that. I would love to see what your research shows on how radio has kind of, it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and yet listeners are there by the millions. But the industry itself is, you don't have full staffs anymore. And dang it, dude, I got to be honest with you. I blame it on this Jack Welch in the way that he cut back.
But it's not just the cutting back. You're absolutely right. It's not just the cutting back, though. You have to remember the industry has gotten more concentrated.
Yep.
It used to be the case that there were dozens of companies that own stations all over the country. Now there's like, one or two. Yeah. And what's right? And so the result, but let's think about that. Okay. There's less competition. That means there's less incentive for them to have competitive wages. It means that they feel like they can do more with less. And it means that as they continue to make a really handsome profit, mind you, it's the executives and the institutional investors who are seeing the lion's share of those profits, not the people in the stations. Listen, I work in the media industry too, and I know that my industry, reporters at papers all across this country are woefully underpaid, and it's why there's been an exodus from our industry and yours as well.
Right. I would love to see this book in the hands of people in Russia as they continue to change over there economically. Because, I mean, you know, they had, I mean, Jack Welch he changed the world. He didn't just change America.
That's absolutely right. And listen, Russia is a whole nother can of worms.
Right.
And right, if I had a policy prescription there, I would just advocate for a freer and more open civil society. So the people of Russia, which I still get the sense that they actually knew what was going on, would have a much different take on it, right? I think Russia's problems go deep and far beyond sort of the misallocation of corporate profits. But yeah, I would love to see a cross-border debate, right? I think if we can start anywhere and start talking, that'd be a positive first step.
Now, what did you personally learn by putting this together? Because you can't put a book together, you can't be a reporter unless you invest your soul into that story.
That's right. Listen, I would talk about what I learned about the world and maybe even a little about what I learned about myself. I've been covering business for more than a decade now, and I've seen the highs and lows. I interviewed Bernie Madoff, Ponzi in prison. I sat with him. I sat with him in prison and talked to him. So I've seen the dark side of business. I've also written stories about people who are getting it right. What I learned from this project is that even when the story seems to end in the boardroom, right? When the CEO retires, you sort of think that's the end of their story. But what this project brought home is the fact that the consequences of companies and individuals like Welch, who have so much power, they actually endure for years and decades later. And so when I look out at the economy right now, and I think back on the conversation we've just had, it's clear that the things I talk about in my book, while they may have happened 20 and 30 and even 40 years ago, they're still reverberating through our lives today. And that really brought home the sort of the importance of this kind of work, really trying to understand the forces that shape our history. Listen, for myself, it's made me all the more committed to telling stories like this that really matter and that are going to matter, I think, not just tomorrow and the next day, but the next year and years after that.
Aren't you, in a very strong way, subliminally telling today's leaders, because it's changed on that leadership role, that, look, whatever decision you make today has the ability and power to change someone's life decades later. So make a wise decision. Or, you know what I mean?
I hope I'm not subliminal. That's exactly my message, right? This is what I'm trying to get through the heads of the CEOs that I talk to and who read my work, which is that, listen, and it's not just the CEOs of big companies, it's managers.
Yep.
It's the CEOs of small and medium-sized businesses all across this land, right? How you treat your people affects not only your profit margin, but it affects them and their families and their communities. And listen, I'm not a socialist. I'm not calling for everyone to be paid the same. That's not what we're talking about here. But we're talking about making sure that we collectively take care of our people and that we as a country take care of each other. Because, man, you know it, I know it, we are in a hard spot. And I think a first step to turning the corner is making sure that all the riches of this land actually benefit as many of us as they possibly can.
One of the things that I've fallen witness to a lot over the past year and a half or so are those managers who look at their employees, who are the worker bees of the company. You don't want to be here, go home. And their theory is that hit them at the money line and they'll shape up. I don't think that is so true, because they're just going to go to another job.
In my book, I highlight instances where companies have done the exact opposite to great effect. I highlight companies that started paying their workers more because they realized it was the right thing to do. And guess what happened? Productivity increased.
Yep.
Retention increased. Turnover declined. The quality of customer care went up. KPIs, right? Like net promoter scores, all the business metrics that business people care about, everything went in the right direction because they were taking better care of their people. And yes, it cost a bit more money, but guess what happened? Because everything else was going well, the stock price went up. They were making more money. There was more to be had. And those are the kind of lessons I think CEOs need to be looking at rather than continuing to worship at the altar of Jack Welch.
You seem to be the type of person, you don't go to work to have a job. You go to work because you made a choice to show up. It's a choice. It's not a job.
Yeah, there's truth to that. And I recognize I'm super privileged to be able to do this.
Yeah.
And I'm writing this book in hopes that for the millions of people who don't necessarily have that choice get to sort of do what they love, right? This aspirational thing. I'm super fortunate. I get to do that in large measure. But my hope is that even for people who don't, that they can still have valuable, productive, fulfilling work experiences because the people, the organizations they work for are treating them right.
Yeah. Where can people go to find out more about what you're doing? Because once again, we talked about this earlier, but this is a continuation. You've been on this a very long time. So people are going to want to know more about you.
The book is The Man Who Broke Capitalism.
Yep.
My website is davidgellis, GELLES.com. And I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. The Man Who Broke Capitalism.
And they're going to be shocked that you look like Seth MacFarlane. How many times have you heard that?
First time, but I'll take it.
Dude, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
You name it. I'm here. Thanks
right.
for having me.
Will you be brilliant today, okay, sir?
I appreciate it. You too.